Welcome to another episode of the Geordie and Josh podcast. Geordie, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Pretty good. It's the end of the week, and it's nice to be able to take a break a little bit this weekend. But what are we here for? I wanted to talk to you. We wanted to talk. We've been doing these really interesting podcasts. We were talking about language today and what that means in terms of how we embrace it from our perspectives. We're both teachers. I'm also a journalist. You're a geographer, and we interact with language all the time in terms of how we talk to people and how people talk to us. And I think we have some sort of strong views about how language is judged in our culture in terms of the words we use and the words we don't use. And so that's sort of the genesis of how we got started talking about this. And so I guess I just wanted to sort of throw it out there with you and just sort of have a conversation about what does language mean to you in the context of 2022 and how judgy everybody is about everything everybody does all the time. If you use the wrong word, people freak out, and just sort of how dangerous that is.
Yeah, well, and I think how judgy everyone is now about language is the same for any period of time, right? We use language as a way to separate and divide people, whether it's dividing them based on, class and social class or level of education, whether it's a way of sort of identifying who's educated, who's not educated, formally educated. We use it as a way to regional accents or regional vernaculars that can tell you something about where a person is from is also used as a way to divide and create elitist ideas of like, oh no, but we're from over here, which means that somehow we're this much better. And you can tell that from the way that we speak. So language today is used definitely to judge and to separate, but I think that's always been, as long as we've been speaking, we've used it as a way to I think humans use any tool they can to separate each other and to create hierarchies. And language is a very easy tool since we have to use language to communicate with one another. So it's an very easy way to sort of pick out and separate and define. And so today we could look at, like today as in this current time in history, we could look at how we use the old sort of version of separating, figuring out, oh, are you speaking grammatically, I'm not even going to say grammatically correctly. Um, are you speaking in a way that identifies you as part of a political movement, as part of a conservative or liberal or hyper conservative? No, I shouldn't say hyper conservative. What's the term I'm looking for?
Ultra? No.
Yeah, there you go. And ultra liberal.
Radical. Just kidding.
Yeah. If I say anything about not wanting to wear a mask, does that put me in a camp of being an anti-vaxxer, even if I'm 100% for vaccinations, but I just don't want to wear an N95 mask when I'm trying to communicate with people so that they can like see the full range of my face, for example? That would be, one example where you might be afraid to express your opinion on something and now I'm getting into the realm of like, oh, but it's for public safety. No, I get that. Like, but can we have a conversation about how it's uncomfortable, even if we understand that wearing a mask is necessary for public safety? Can I just say it's uncomfortable without being put into an anti-vaxxer pro-Trump category? So yeah, we could talk about the way that we use language to politically divide or put you in one camp versus another camp. It's language. One big thing about language is it's very binary. It's used in a way to create binaries. It's used in a way to create like, are you with us or are you against us? And there's not a real gray area a lot of the time. That's one of the ways that we use language. So yeah, there's a lot of talking about language today. There's a lot of ways that we divide people based on words that we use or certain key phrases that we might use. that put us in a woke or not woke or a ultra conservative or an ultra liberal or whatever. Even, think about those signs that people put on their front lawns, where they'll say all these things like, we believe love is love, we believe Black Lives Matter, we believe, and that's great. Like those are wonderful things to express. But it's almost like putting yourself in a linguistic camp that's saying like, I'm on this side, like very clearly using language and specific phrases that say like, oh, you're one of these people, I can trust you, I can talk to you. And that can be good as a safe haven if you think about different ways that we've communicated in the past when you can't, well, I could get into like nonverbal types of communication too, like ways that when you can't say something out loud, when you can't say like, I'm safe for you as, let's say, a gay person. If we're looking at periods in history where being gay, or places in the world where being gay is literally something you can be killed for, there's nonverbal ways to sort of say like, I am a safe person to come to. Like the pink flamingo. I don't know if you're aware that the pink flamingo was a sign that you were pro gay rights back in the day. So having like a pink flamingo on your front lawn was a way of telling people that you were either gay or you were gay friendly. So yeah.
We have one in the backyard. It's a swimming pool thing. So that's good to know. Double meaning. Well, it's funny because you reminded me with the signs. And then of course, everything in life, I always go back to Seinfeld and this TV show, which I like. I was talking to you about, off camera, but there's that episode, I don't know if you've seen it. Speaking of language, where and symbols, is when he's doing the AIDS walk. Kramer's doing the AIDS walk, and his whole thing is, I'm not going to wear the AIDS ribbon. And the whole premise of the episode is, how are you not going to wear the ribbon? Right. And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm walking, I'm raising money, I'm volunteering, I'm giving my time. But he wasn't want to do the group thing and wear the ribbon. And they're just like, put it on. And so like they attack him and they beat him up. And he, and it's sort of, I think, pointing out like, are we judging actions or are we judging symbols? And I think that's part of what happens. And I think in our role as teachers, we have to take the secondary sort of approach, which is, we can't judge. We're not there to judge the careful communication and articulation of our students, because young people, I mean, people of all ages, but people who are 18, 19, 20, they're formulating their ability to think and to write, to communicate, to speak. And when you are doing that, you make mistakes, or you do trial by error, and you talk out loud. And of course, the greatest growth that we have with students, and this translates to people in general, is feeling safe to be able to talk without judgment. Because if you can talk without judgment, then you will express more, you will give more. If you judge a student too early, and I'm sure we've made this mistake, every teacher on the planet has made this mistake. If you interrupt that student while they're expressing something super important to them, maybe they pause, or they are struggling, or they're using words that you're like, that doesn't make sense. If you stop them, you'll shut them down. And I think one of the challenges of language is that too often people, adults, just like really smart people, will hear somebody say something and say, you're not using the right term, so therefore you can't be part of this conversation. And that's really dangerous, because that's actually a very privileged, to use a language term, that's a very privileged approach, to be able to say, you're not speaking this way, therefore you can't be part of this conversation, or I'm going to judge you. Because we don't know people's backgrounds. We don't know people's education levels. We don't know what they've been taught. And unlearning things is a real thing. If you've been taught your entire life to speak a certain way, and then now you're exposed to new people, well, you don't overnight adopt the new language and vocabulary of what's politically correct and acceptable. It's an evolution. And so for me, when we talk about that, I think we need to give people more grace in the terms that they use, more forgiveness. And if it's so horrible that they're using words that we don't like, let's talk to them about it. Let's have a conversation about it.
Right. Yeah, you have to think, what is the goal here? So if somebody says something that, let's say we're talking about anti-misogyny, we're talking about something that words or phrases or ways of speaking that negatively impact a certain gender or a certain group of people based on sexuality, whatever. If somebody doesn't use the right terminology that puts them in the camp of, oh, they get it, they understand, if they're on that, hopefully on that path to learning to understand and understand other perspectives and why certain things are important, and you shut somebody down because they use a phrase that feels archaic, feels like, oh, why are you saying that? You shouldn't, that's so 10 years ago. You have to think, what is the goal? Is the goal to create allies? Is the goal to spread awareness and understanding? Or is the goal to just know that you are the correct person, that you get it, and the rest of the world doesn't get it? So as an instructor, as a teacher, right, I always tell my students in the beginning of the class, and I remind them like throughout class, depending on the class, especially like in my human geography class or world regional geography class, we'll talk about things that are, we'll talk about race and racism, we'll talk about sexism, we'll talk about women around the world. And I always say, like, everyone in this class, we need to keep in mind that we are putting the most charitable construct on our neighbors, that we are trying, that if they say something that to us doesn't sound as advanced as we are in our understanding, then you want to think like, no, but they're trying to learn, because that's the goal in this classroom, is that somebody is trying to learn. And that if you shut somebody down, what you've most likely done is just shut off an ally, a possible ally, instead of encouraging an ally. I remind students of that over and over again, especially when we start talking about the stuff that makes people really sort of like scared to speak out, or scared to sort of, like, if I say to a class, which I often do, is like, what is race? What does the term race mean? Then I'll just get silence because people don't want to say the wrong thing. So I remind them, like, remember, we're in here to learn, and you're never going to learn if you don't walk yourself through what you're thinking, if you don't allow yourself to express that. Another thing I make sure students know in the beginning and all through class is, when you're writing me a paper, I'm not an English teacher. I'm not here to judge your grammar or your, whatever, your sentence structure, if you put it in a proper essay form or whatever. I want you to get your thoughts out. So as long as that doesn't look like some long, 2-page full sentence, like you just are coming off of Molly and took a bump of Coke, and you like write it out on your phone at 3 a.m, as long as it doesn't look like that, and I can read it, that's all I want you to worry about, is getting your thoughts out on paper, so that you can think. I used to teach English as a second language to refugees. So I used to work for this organization. I taught ESL to refugees, and I learned pretty early, teaching classrooms full of students who often didn't speak the same language, that the way that we teach English, we front load it with grammar and this is any language. If you were teaching French or German or whatever, you would front load it with grammar and with conjugation, verb conjugation, and all that good stuff. And I realized that nobody is going to get to a level of comfort with the language, and like a level of comfort where they can conjugate verbs, if they're not comfortable with like saying at least a couple of words. So I started teaching those classes where we would just have conversations at first, and the verb conjugation, and grammar and everything was all over the place. But the goal was to get people comfortable so that they could then kind of learn the rules. Think about it. Think about any game. If you're learning ping pong, and I'm just reminded of my nephew and my daughter having this ping pong game about a year ago, and like they could barely hit the ball back and forth to each other. And my nephew was so just focused on the rules of the game, where everything was like, no, that's out, that's, and I was like, why don't you just like hit the ball back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and kind of like focus on getting to a point where you could actually have a rally before you bring in all the rules, because otherwise you're never going to get to a point where you can play the game and apply the rules. He wasn't very happy with that. But yeah, it's kind of the same thing with language, or with learning a new ideology, learning something, is if you don't get to a point where you're comfortable speaking about it, then how are you going to learn the rules and the correct terms and the correct, whether it's the correct terms for an ideology, whether it's the correct terms for like the rules of a language, whether it's the correct rules for anything. You have to be able to play around, think about something, tinker with something before you can get to a point where you can then kind of perfect how you're presenting it.
Yeah, and on the issues that's those are good points. And the ping pong analogy is perfect, because if you ever played with somebody who's like over fixated on rules in anything, and you're just like, I just have fun here, I just want to play. If you just have that part of it, then you're more likely to be like, okay, what are the rules? But when we're talking about these big things, so language, there's little words we use, but there's also change that needs to happen. You know, when we're talking about issues of gender pronouns or trans rights, there's always these debates over languages, okay? And the people who get the most attention in that debate are the most ignorant people who use the wrong terms, and they're like, woman is woman and man is man. And those are the ones that need to feel like they can have a conversation where they can be educated about it. Because if we just cut them off and say, you're dumb, you don't understand, right?
Right.
That's not growth. And if you want growth, you're going to have to, we may not want to, and it may be unfair. And it's like, why do we got to bend over backwards for these people who've been systemically oppressing people for generations? Okay, fine. But if you actually want to change them, you're going to have to talk to them so they can get to the point where they're like, oh, I get it, you know, and that happens. But if you just cut them off and call them dumb and racist and bigots instantly, well, you've lost them, you know, and they're never, and you can't just wait for them to die. That's not like good manners. I mean, that's not a way to try to create change for everyone who's involved. And in
Well,
my experience,
and
most
that's not a
people,
solution either. Sorry, just
yeah,
get in.
I was saying, in my experience, sometimes the most hardened people will change if you just take the time to explain that to them in a way where they feel safe enough to say, actually, I don't understand it. And then you're like, oh, now I know where all your stupid hatred comes from. You just don't understand it. Let's help you understand. And I think that's part of it. We had these conversations with feminists, remember, in the 80s and 90s, like, if you were a feminist, what did that mean? Okay. And then we had to redefine the term. Men are feminists too, right? Doesn't mean you're, you know, weak, doesn't mean you're anything. It just means that you, as much as women, support equality for women. And that's a good thing, right?
Right.
But some men see the word feminist as meaning like whatever stereotype in the late 80s they thought it was a feminist was marching in parades doing, you know. And so
Right.
I think that's part of it. It's just like this patience of understanding of like, stop.
Well,
We, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
well, a couple of things. So, one, I would say that lots of people, not just men, but all people will do that with either the term feminist, or, you find plenty of people who have internalized misogyny and don't want to be associated with that term either. But with the issue of, whether it's talking about trans people or different issues that particularly affect marginalized groups, I want to clarify that what we're saying, or what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say, isn't so much that trans people need to have that conversation, you know, that I can understand how a trans person wouldn't necessarily want to explain to some bigoted person, right, like what it means to be trans or what it means to be female or male, and how their term is archaic and is sexist and is limiting to everybody, not just trans people, but to everybody, to define, let's say, women, for example, as somebody who has a working uterus. I mean, that's not even all cis women. You know, if we're going to talk about what it is to be female, why are we still defining being a woman by her reproductive capabilities? I mean, not all women can reproduce for many reasons. Either they don't have a uterus, their uterus isn't working, their uterus is past working, the uterus never started working. You know, like, we are so much more than just our ability to reproduce. So there's a lot of harm in trying to be so specific about defining what it means to be female, and it's harm to everyone. But yeah, I can understand how people who have been traumatized for whether it's you know, racist trauma, sexist trauma, transphobia, homophobia, and may not want to explain to someone. It's the same thing with sexual assault. You know, people wonder why somebody who has been sexually assaulted doesn't come out and talk about it for years and years. I mean, it's traumatic, and you have to defend yourself when you're the victim, right? So I can understand that. That's why being an ally is so important, because we can have those conversations. People who aren't directly impacted by, let's say, transphobia, can have those conversations where we can explain to somebody and be maybe patient with somebody, and also understand that maybe 70% of people actually want to understand, but there's going to be a 30%. And that's true, I think, in any educational experience, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's teaching people how to farm, whether it's teaching people why trans people are people. There's always going to be a 30% that just does not want, will not, you know, you cannot reach. But if you, as an ally, are thinking about that other 70%, that 70% of people who might just be ignorant, who might have their own trauma. I think that a lot of people who are homophobic, transphobic, sexist have trauma around, let's say we're talking about like a sexist cis man, right? So, you know, they might have their own trauma around their masculinity, and that they've been conditioned to believe that masculinity is something that's toxic, that needs to be shown through brute force or through anger or through, you know, pounding people. So if as allies, or as a person who feels they can talk somebody through that, and like talk through that hatred and that anti whoever sentiment, that's a great thing. But the expectation that anybody should be able to do that, like people who have trauma around their gender, around their sexuality, around their experience, whatever it is, that's why allies are important, is that we need to be the people who can have those conversations. So when I see trans people, for example, not want to talk about those things, I'm like, okay, I get it. When I see people who aren't trans, who are just speaking for the trans community, be overwhelmed and just shut somebody down, I'm like, what kind of an ally? Like, again, what is the goal? Like, if your goal is to be an ally, what are you doing? You know? Yeah.
So the question is, are we spending as a society too much time on this 30%? You know, that's because
Right.
they're never going to change. Then that's, you know, maybe we say, well, that's not going to happen.
Well, I think if that 30% has no power, then yeah, we are. But is that 30%, you know, disproportionately representing us in Congress, or disproportionately representing us in politics, or in corporate policy? Then yeah, that's a concern. It's, where is that 30%? Where are those 30% of people who are just not going to budge on this? And you know, they're not probably concentrated all in positions of power, but that is one big issue, is when we see like, where is this 30%? Where are these people who are just not going to listen, or not going to think about change? Are they disproportionately affecting us? And then what do we do about that? Right.
Yeah, and that's Donald Trump, right? That's sort of like,
And
yeah.
that's who he attracts too,
What's that?
he's become a voice
Right.
for for that sort of way of thinking. I was thinking about how he made fun of toilets. Remember, on one of his tirades, he was talking about like low flow toilets,
Hmm.
which is a real, not only is it a necessity, we need to get rid of freshwater toilets together, especially here in the Southwest. I mean, it is just ridiculous that we take potable water that we can drink and we literally uh, crap in it, right? So there's that whole issue. But I remember him making fun of toilets and low flow toilets. Like, it was almost like he was trying to tap into this idea of toxic masculinity, as like they're trying to weaken us by weakening the flow of water that's coming through our toilets. It's like, what is your problem with efficiency in toilets? Like, why is this something? How is this
Why is this an issue?
well, and how is it tapping into a psyche? How are there people who are like, yeah, we need more water, like literally fresh water that we're going to dump down our toilets? So yeah, he's speaking to a specific constituency that is maybe that constituency that's not going to be reachable. But are they going to be responsible for the next presidential election? Because then, yeah, we do need to worry how to reach these people, or how to yeah.
You know,
How to,
there's words that have meanings that we get all worked up about. Okay, that as a society, and we've seen like words come up in our culture about centering people, and um, you know, the word woke obviously comes up. It's actually, some people say just white people using the word woke is appropriation, because
right.
it's black term, and when you use it, you should not be, not you, but just people should not be using it
Well,
to
no, I mean,
just put people in a category when they have no idea of the origin of the word and what it actually means. And so there's those kind of words, but then there's like more basic stuff, and I'm interested in sort of like, you as a parent, we did our parenting podcast too, is like, how do you deal with language like the F word, or shit, or all these other words that we kind of have euphemisms for? And how do you deal with that in terms of like, do you shelter your daughter? What about the classroom? Do you have rules for, like, you can't have a potty mouth in the classroom? Like, you get 5 F words a class, and then I'm cutting you off. I mean, do those words have any impact in terms of, should we, because we do judge people, right? If you walk into a job interview and you just start dropping the F-bomb, you're not
right.
getting the job. Okay,
No.
but yet you get the job, and you become friends with that person, and you go on a business trip, and you're taking a road trip, and you drop the F-bomb. They're like, well, that's normal. This is so we know people use those terms. But what
Yeah.
are your thoughts on those, like George Carlin 7 words, that people avoid?
Well, so if I were to apply that rule of like 5 F words in my classroom, I would have to follow that rule, and I definitely don't. So it's funny with my daughter, she's 15, and she never swears in front of me. And I know she swears, like I know she swears to other people. But she will never swear in front of me. And I really wonder why that is, because I've been swearing in front of her since she was born and before. I mean, my so swear words are a very interesting part of understanding culture. I always tell students, if you want to really understand a culture, you first want to like kind of get like, what is this culture about? What is the society about? Look at language, but specifically look at their swear words, and music, of course, look at music, but specifically look at what a culture thinks is a bad word. Because words are, language is so interesting. We make it up. It's 100% human created. And then we decide that some words are bad and some words are good and some words are, whatever. And so we make this thing up and then we're like, but nobody can say it. um, but if you look at what swear words mean, and we kind of assume the F word, for example, is a word that you would find in any language, but it's not true at all. Like, so the F word means sex. And so the assumption that every language thinks that the worst word if we thought about the F word as the worst word that's not specific to a marginalized group, right? What does it say about our culture that the worst thing you could say, as long as it's not attached to a marginalized group, is sex, right? Like, what does that say about our culture? And it's not true for every culture. If we look at Georgia, for example, not the state, but the country, the worst thing you can say is your mom. It's so bad to say your mom that people don't use it, like they don't use the proper term when they're trying to. Sometimes you have to talk about your mom, like your mom went to the store, but they'll say mom, your went to the store, because it's such a negative thing to say your mom. So that tells you a lot about that culture, right? Is clearly your mom is somehow so important that she's also become the dirtiest, worst thing that you could talk about. I mean, you could go and culturally analyze what's going on there. Or if we went to Northern Europe, Scandinavian languages, the worst thing you can talk about is God or not having God. So when we look at like language, it tells us a lot about culture. Or if you look at cultures that have been, completely thrown out of their homeland or have no homeland, have gone through a diaspora and are sort of like wandering the world and in different pockets, language becomes their homeland. If you think about like Yiddish, which is speaking.
I'm judging right now.
Which is spoken by Ashkenazi Jews, so specifically Eastern European Jews. Yiddish it's mostly German with some Hebrew and some Russian, but it's kind of become the homeland since there is no actual physical homeland for Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. Or if you look at the Roma people, the people who used to be referred to as gypsies or are still referred to as gypsies, but that's a derogatory term. So their language, again, because they don't have a homeland, their language has become their homeland. So if we want to really get to know other cultures and societies, one of the first things to do is look at, not only what your language is, but what do you hold dear in language and what do you think of as bad in language? So if I could and I won't say these words because then even it's ridiculous that we can have a conversation around language and there are certain words that I just can't say because it will turn people off right away, even though I'm talking about why we think of a certain word as so negative. But if you think about like the worst thing you can call a woman in English rhymes with brunt.
Runt. Yeah.
I was trying to think of something that wasn't runt. That's just a word for genitalia. So what does it say about us that the worst thing that we call someone is the worst thing that you can call someone who's female is genitalia? What does that say about what we think of women and how we both glorify and demonize their sexuality and glorify and demonize them based on how their sexuality is expressed? Excuse me. So yeah, or what does it mean that here's a word that I can say, interestingly enough, vagina is the term that's like what people think of as the medical term for female genitalia, but it's only one part of female genitalia. Like there's so much more to female genitalia. There's, the labia and the vulva and the crown jewel of them all, the clitoris, which is nowhere near, well, it's near the vagina, but it's not in the vagina. So what does it say about us that we have narrowed female genitalia down, which is all these wonderful things, to just the part that is there for the purpose of reproduction. The vagina is the canal that leads to the uterus. So, but the clitoris is not in the vagina. It's, you know, to the north of the vagina. So what does that say about us and like how we think of this medical term for female genitalia is actually not incorporating all female genitalia. It's completely ignoring the best part of female genitalia, which again is the clitoris, which is the only organ that is completely dedicated to pleasure. It has no other function. That's not true on men. Men don't have a one organ dedicated to just pleasure. So
Without a dual use. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, we can do let's do a whole hour on that topic down the road. But the C word, have you been referred to that? Obviously, I don't think I have, at least to my face, but I'm sure every woman has been called that, or it's such a terrible term. Yeah, and if so, how did that make you feel, or what do you, we're talking about language, and so if somebody, if you heard, let's say you're one of your students walking out of the room, right, and they just don't like you, and they're like, she's such a C word, how would you take that,
Well, so yeah, I've been called that probably more times than I've been called my first name, or maybe that's like on par with each other. But I used to really hate that word. When I was growing up, I was called it a lot by my dad. Oh, I just brought the mood down. But my dad would call, everybody in our household that. So for a long time, it was this like really like shameful, shameful term. It like triggered all these kind of shameful feelings in me. And so I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't go anywhere near the word. And then I started thinking, probably in my early 20s, like, well, why am I running away from this? Literally running away from the word and running away from the trauma that is triggered by that word. I have to really feel what that means so that I can understand it, so that I can, move on from that trauma. So I started really like exploring the word, thinking about like what it triggered and all the feelings that it triggered. And after that, I just freaking love that word. It's just this, I wish that I could use it all the time in everyday conversation, because it's this fantastic word. And I know a lot of people hear that and they're like, no, it's so negative. Is it, to be called that, to be called the C word? And let's say, one of my students walked out and was just like, what a, I think I would be probably somewhat hurt to hear a student say that, but at the same time, what does it mean? It means that you're not following a standard of femininity that follows a very specific idea of how women are supposed to present themselves, women are supposed to act, women are supposed to shy away from certain ideas around sexuality or expressing their sexuality. Women are supposed to shy away from certain words that might degrade them. Women are supposed to shy away from tattoos. Like women are the number of people who have told me that they don't like tattoos on women. It's like, well, then don't be a woman and get a tattoo, this idea that you can express how you feel about how I'm going to present myself, and how in presenting myself or expressing myself somehow puts me in a category of not being the right type of woman. If that right type of woman is a C word, then yes, I'm very happy to be that type of woman. I would rather be somebody who has agency over myself. And if that turns me into someone you think of as a C word, well, then that's okay with me. That's why I love that word.
Yeah. That's really well said. And another euphemism for that word is like the P word, rhymes with wussy. Well, and that men get called that. And so like every time in my entire life I've ever not been peer pressured into doing something, another man has said that, you're such a P word, right?
Can't we say that word in reference to a cat?
Yeah, we could say pussycat. Yeah.
Pussycat? I call my pussycats pussycat all the time. That's what Sophia called Dorothy in the Golden Girls. She'd always refer to her as
pussycat. Yeah. That's right. But it's sort of like a sign of weakness, like, oh, you don't want to go to the strip club with me, you're such a vagina, that's what they're saying, right? It's like you might as well have one, and
Right.
that is a I know every man will never say to anyone out loud that that's how they talk, and that's how men talk. They private, they like refer to weak men as that.
Right.
But then men can use the term too, like when we talk about trauma, when you're constantly told, because I mean, whatever, I'm not going to get into myself because people are like, oh, stop, Josh. But
I've
I
told people that my dad regularly referred to me as a C word, but that's all right. You keep your trauma to yourself.
um, I'm, I've been referred to a lot in my life, and I've been bullied, and I've been called the P word a lot of times because I'm not super, I don't have that sort of thing about me, and I do have a layer of sensitivity and all that, whatever. Um, it traumatizes you, right? You start to think, well, maybe there's something wrong. Maybe I am like a weak man, And then I used the word one time around a woman, like, oh my God, I feel like such a blank, because I didn't, such a wussy. And then I'm called on it. Like, don't say that because you're basically using it in a way that implies that you're inferior or that you're weak. And actually, the P word is power. It's like that's this thing that it's actually the opposite. It's not weak. It's
Oh
something
yeah.
that's so it's unfortunate that we use these terms and then like what's a mean guy? He's a dick, or
Right.
he's an ass, whole, it's like you're always, I don't know why it is that we're referred to negative, mean, bad things having to do with that part of the body, right? It's
Right.
like, well, you got screwed. It's like, I thought, is that a bad thing? Is that what's the
Thought that
deal?
was a good thing. I thought that was the goal. Uh, yeah, I think again, it tells us a lot about our culture that we everything bad gets referenced back to sex or something to do with sex. And the idea that, pussycat without the cat is this negative term for men tells you that, again, we think that women's genitalia is the worst thing that our society has to offer, right? Like, whether it's getting thrown back at a woman in the C word form, or whether a man is being called it in some form because he's weak, it's again saying like women's genitalia, female genitalia is the worst thing that we have to offer, which is so interesting because maybe that's why they're constantly trying to control it, uh, since it's such a terrible thing. But Betty White, again, Golden Girls reference, but Betty White said, what did she say? She said something along the lines of, I don't know why this is a term that's used for weakness. If you've ever been around a vagina, that thing can take a pounding and keep going, right? Like, um, I'm paraphrasing Betty White,
Or
but yeah, it's interesting that strength then again goes back to genitalia, and is male genitalia is cojones or balls or whatever. That the idea that like if you have strength, if you're going to do something, if you have any chutzpah at all, then you're using your male genitalia as opposed to your female genitalia, which is weakness. And so if you think about testicles, I mean, those are some of the most afraid. I mean,
sensitive.
okay, let's go with sensitive, but like even if they're a little bit cold, they like wrap themselves back up in the body, right? Like they're so like sensitive to just even the slightest temperature change, that they'll move depending on temperature change. If you just do like a little flicking or a little, I mean, it half the men who just heard me say that cringe. So how come
I
that?
almost said don't flick, and I stopped myself. But since you said it, I'll say yeah. I cringed. Yes.
Yeah, that that body part comes to mean strength when it's this very sensitive, as you say, part of the body. a really weak part of the body, as opposed to female genitalia, which, I mean, I had a gigantic baby come out of mine, right? Like, and it's still there. It wasn't like obliterated off the face of the earth, even after I had this huge, fully formed, almost toddler child to come out of it. So what is really actually strong versus highly sensitive? And why do we switch what they actually are and like have the opposite be the word for strength or word for weakness? I had this conversation with my cousin once, and he said, oh, it's because being brave is being afraid and doing it anyway. And he somehow turned that into testicles are always afraid, but you do it anyway. Like I'm not so sure about that.
Was that like just off the top of the head, or did they have to think about that for a while? Because that's a pretty interesting little narrative there.
I know. I don't know. It was, how do we have, I think we had that exchange like over text or over, yeah, I think he had time to think about
So
it.
they're
But
warriors, actually. They're
exactly,
valiant.
they're warriors. Yeah, they're shaking and squishing themselves up in the cold, but they're like, I'm gonna go and do it anyway. That's what it is to have cojones, I guess. Um, and maybe, I mean, maybe like, but really, I think it's the more obvious, which is male genitalia is seen as strong. I mean, look at like every sign of victory in war. What is it emphasized with? What is it commemorated with? A gigantic penis. Like every obelisk that they erected, literally erected
Hmm.
after winning a battle in Europe, winning a battle here in North America, they literally just put up an obelisk, which is a giant penis.
Mhm.
The Washington Monument, this monument that's supposed to encapsulate Americana, is a huge penis. And when I say that, people are like, no, it's not. Are you kidding? Have you seen first of all, have you seen a penis? But also, have you seen all the pictures around people like pretending to, like, have you seen people take those pictures where they're
Yeah.
like, yeah. So I don't think I'm the only one who sees it. But, and one thing I don't understand is why people argue when I say like, that is a giant penis. Like the Eiffel Tower is a giant penis.
Mhm.
And people are like, no, it's not. It's just, well, of course it is. I mean, we live in a society, and these are, like, I just named two societies that think of masculinity as kind of the ultimate goal in life,
Yeah.
as the best thing ever. And so it would make sense that those societies, those cultures would enshrine what it is to be masculine, like boil down what it is to be masculine to genitalia, and then literally turn that into a shrine. So it makes sense that if you live in a society that is paternal, that sees masculinity as the ultimate strength, that you would then use a symbol of masculinity to show that strength, to show that yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and it's everywhere. I mean, if you're ever on a road trip and you just start sort of like looking at the architecture of things and buildings, and you're like, there's a million ways to design these things, but there's a very common pattern in how things are designed. And it's typically because men have been doing these things and they sort of see power in a certain kind of symbol because it's reflective of what they would hope they would be. And so I think that's definitely true, to a large degree. Um, do you have any like hard stops, like thresholds for language where you are engaging with somebody and you're like, nope, I'm not going to go there. I need to stop you there. You're throwing around this term and I don't like it. Do you have anything like that? Or is it pretty much you're always going to be able to stop them? Obviously, the N word, I think we would agree when that comes up, you're just like, okay, stop.
Well,
Uh,
yeah,
you know,
like if
those kind of
somebody,
terms. But like, are there other terms that you're just like, whoa, we can't continue talking about our days. I need to address that you just said that.
oh yeah, yeah. So, and we can agree that if somebody just like rolled out the N word, that neither of us would be comfortable with, like, okay, just
Yeah.
yeah, okay. I don't know, it depends. I think it really depends on the context. I mean, it's hard to say because I like to embrace the words that are used against, that are supposed to be like negative connotations of women. Can we say, because again, talking about animals, the other really negative term for women, or one of the other really negative terms for women, is the B word. Can I say that word?
Yeah.
So like bitch, which is, again, I like to embrace that word, even though I know there's a lot of women and people in general who are uncomfortable with that word. Anything that's been used negatively against women, I like to think of as like, okay, well, it's been used negatively against women as a way to control women, as a way to control their sexuality, their reproduction, all of that. So if you're going to use it to minimize women into a very specific role and feminine, and I'm not saying feminine identity is bad, but a specific idea of a feminine identity, well, then I'm going to embrace that. That's something that I'm going to go for. So, but again, it depends. I mean, it really depends if someone just because the flip side of that is using that term in a way where, let's say a student gets mad at me for whatever reason, they get a bad grade on a test, they don't like something that I say, they can minimize me to a bitch and use 10,000 years of misogyny to just turn me into, instead of me as a thinking individual, turn me into just this one sort of mass. It's a way of dismissing me based on, really, on my genitalia, like not even on a concept of gender, but based on my genitalia. So, you want to, depending on the conversation, you want to kind of address that, like, why is that your go-to? Why if somebody who's gay makes you mad, would you call them the gay F word? Be specific between the F word and the gay F word, right? Like, why is that your go-to when you feel weakened or when you feel threatened by something, to take whatever marginalization that might be associated with this person, marginalized identity that might be associated with this person? Why do you use that as a way to just dismiss them? What does that say about you, about your go-to is to dismiss somebody based on a marginalized social concept, right? And say like, well, it doesn't matter what she thinks because she's just a bitch, right? Which is basically saying like, it doesn't matter what she thinks, she's a woman. And in the end, we all know that women are run by their uteruses, and that's really all they're good for.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it would really depend on the conversation and how someone is using that term. And like in class, for example, when I talk about how in some classes, I talk about how, like, where certain words come from and why they're used, like the gay F word, for example. It's got to be a better way of saying it than that, but that's a term for a bundle of sticks. And the reason that became a term for, like, a derogatory term for gay people, is because they used to burn gay people with witches, but they would just throw them directly onto the fire instead of the stake that they would use for witches. So what I try to say to students when we're talking about, like, because I'll inevitably get well, you can't say anything anymore. Well, you can say whatever you want, but what are you contributing to? You're contributing to a history of burning people alive because of who they're in love with. You're contributing to a history of, incarcerating, murdering, enslaving people based on their skin color. You're contributing to a history of killing, murdering, beating, controlling people based on their genitals. So yeah, so I think, again, the conversation of like, do I have a hard out with certain words? It depends. It depends who am I talking to?
Yeah.
How are they using it? Is it a way of just dismissing people because you don't like what's coming from them, but you can always turn them into this one thing, this one part of their identity, and dismiss that because we all know that whatever that part of their identity is something that is less than. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think that's what's just so important though, is that being able to hear it and explain is such a more valuable, rich solution in the long run than instant shutdown. If you're in a position to do that, as you said, if you're an ally and if you're not, um, the victim of that trauma, and it's like I'm not going to have that conversation, but it's so important to be able to do that if our goal is actually progress and change, and not division, because we're stronger with as many of us as possible going in the same direction, as opposed to splitting and hoping they just kind of die out, which is not good either. It's
Well,
sort of
the reason that, because I've heard that over and over again, like, oh, we just need to wait for these people to die. I mean, there's more people coming up behind them. Like
yeah, they have kids too.
yeah, like I'm old enough now to see that, the generation that I thought, oh, once they're gone, everything will be great. No, there's plenty of people who will replace them. So,
Mhm.
so the dying off doesn't work.
It's interesting because when we talk about language and words in the context of real life, and then there's media, and there's popular culture, and there's music, and I was just sort of thinking about how artists and musicians can get away with a lot. And get away with meaning they can use a lot of these terms that have been um, offensive in the context of art. And I was thinking about, like, we both probably listened to Eminem in the 90s, and maybe we still do. Um, and
I
you think,
listened to Lose Yourself before my final interview with the president at the college. So yeah.
yeah, that's maybe I should have listened to that one too. Yeah. Um, I was probably listening to some Alanis Morissette song about bouncing back. But we talk about Eminem and artists. Like, if you've listened to those songs, they're so offensive in a literal sense. Every word that we're not saying on this, he probably said in the first minute of most of his songs.
Mm.
And yet, I don't know how you feel. My sense is you probably have respect for his artistry, even though he was crazy offensive. Um, why do you think that, like, we can listen to some people say these things and be like, oh yeah, that's great, that's funny, they can do it, but then if you go, repeat it, it's not? Like, what do you think that's all about?
Yeah, I think, well, with, again, so art in general can be used to look at something that's culturally, socially taboo or hidden, or, we're not supposed to talk about certain things. They make people uncomfortable. You're not supposed to talk, like you said, you go to a job interview, there's certain words you're not going to say. If you do say them, you're just not going to get the job, right? So art is a great way of talking about those taboo subjects, bringing them to light, playing with them, making fun of them. I mean, even like right behind me, I've got a Georgia O'Keeffe picture back there, and Georgia O'Keeffe was famous for taking flowers and making them look, I mean, they already look a lot like female genitalia, and bringing that conversation. Again, female genitalia is something that is so taboo in our culture that we literally use it for like the worst things you can think of, whether it's the worst thing you can call a woman or the worst thing you can call a man. So playing around with that and bringing that to a conversation where it's something that represents beauty, and uh, it makes it okay to talk about, like, why are we so afraid of this genitalia? So art serves this incredible purpose. It is, it's what makes us human. But then you have to look at certain things like Eminem, for example, the amount that he uses words like bitch and the F word specific to gay people just screams to me that he has, been like, his toxic masculinity is something that completely has overtaken his entire life. I mean, his entire perspective of the world is clearly impacted by his own insecurities around his masculinity, his sexuality. A lot of people, and there's been a lot of studies on how homophobia comes from people who are closeted. I don't think that's 100% true. I think there's plenty of people who are closeted who are homophobic, but I also think there's a lot of people who have been raised with an idea that to be masculine is something that is very specific to, again, this toxic ideology. And that and they've felt so much pressure their entire life to show that and to prove themselves as this type of strength that we associate with, or that society might associate with what it means to be masculine. And then they see someone come along who's not following those rules, right? So you have someone who's been traumatized trying to prove to the world how masculine they are by following this sort of conditioning of toxic masculinity. And then you have someone who comes along and like paints their nails or just like completely throws off this idea of that that's been pushed on them and that they've been, cloaking themselves with. And I think that is very I think it's very telling when you see someone who has so clearly been conditioned to think that this type of masculinity is how they're supposed to be, and they've forced themselves, probably traumatized themselves and been traumatized trying to follow it. And then when they see someone who's like, I'm not going to follow that, it's like, wait a minute, why have I been doing it this entire time?
Yeah.
So that's what I hear when I hear Eminem. I hear him, and the other side is he has all of this power because he's someone who's so, he's been in the public eye for so long, and him using those words, whether he's traumatized or not, what is it allowing for? What is it supporting? Who is kind of, I can hear him fighting with his toxic masculinity. At the same time, he's almost like, what's the word I'm looking for? Condoning toxic masculinity. Do you know what I'm saying?
Condemning.
No, not condemning.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't think he's condemning toxic masculinity. Do you? I think
Well,
I
I
think
think
supporting.
he's evolved. Like, I think he's like in his I'm much older and wiser mode today, as opposed to the early stuff that made him super, super famous. But yeah, he's condoning, I think in the right, he's sort of
In his earlier work, at least.
acknowledging that it's okay to feel this way. And I think that goes into, obviously this is much bigger than language now, but I think it goes into the disaffected youth and the poor, disgruntled sort of part of our culture and our society that doesn't necessarily get the platform to be able to talk about how horrible their life is. And then when they start talking about it, there's all these other people who connect with that, and they're like, oh yeah, and that's my life too, and I've been told to not use these words, and he's using them, and he's funny. And I think also there's just so much to be said about like great writing. Like, writing really leads to a lot of forgiveness, in the sense of people will hear you if it's presented in a way and it's written in a way or it's spoken in a way that tells a story that makes sense, that resonates, and that is clear with people. And so that's the difference between Lose Yourself, which is a Journey song with it's a Rocky movie with a positive outcome, as opposed to the same message poorly constructed.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of what makes that person appealing and that person's music appealing. And it's the same, we've talked about artists like George Michael and Eminem are like the same person, but like opposite sides, in terms of they both dealt with like this self-loathing in their early
Mhm.
music. And then they, you know, he, Eminem went from talking about, Pamela Lee Anderson in a like vulgar way, and
Right.
date rape and under it, like all horrible stuff, to empowering people about giving your all for one moment to be successful. And how do they do that? It's through like an evolution of art and music. And George Michael, he goes from the tight white shorts singing "I'm Your Man" or "Wake Me Up Before You Go Go" to blowing up Sony Music and talking about he's now free from this manufactured identity. And so I think that there's an evolution, and that's why I think it goes back to the whole language thing. It's like sometimes you just gotta let people be messy and stupid and see where it goes, because you don't get the genius if you don't have people feeling free enough to make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are in public.
Right. Yeah, and owning up to those mistakes too. I don't know, has Eminem ever reconciled with what he might see now as a mistake in his earlier life, or does he see it as like an evolution of his artistry, or
He made
what?
up with his mother, I know
Yeah,
that.
I know
um,
that. Yeah.
but I don't know. I think his way of doing it is sort of like just not making those kinds of music, and like, I mean, he would never make an album today like his debut album. Instead, it would
Right.
be more about like his sort of his self issues and how that works. But it's that language is so important in terms of how you communicate. You mentioned when you're grading papers, you don't focus on like grammar, like, so you won't correct those kinds of things.
No.
um
And I
were
hear
you
you.
always that way, or is that
Yeah.
something you changed with?
No, I mean, as long as I've been teaching,
Yeah.
I've always followed that, because I because I learned that, when I was teaching ESL, which was in my early 20s. And so when I started teaching at the college, it was well, not that much later, but later. And so I'd already kind of gone into it with that philosophy of how to have like allow people to think, critically analyze, figure out figure like work their way through a thought, work their way through an idea. um and then, English teachers, other people can worry about the grammatical part of it or the conjugation of verbs or whatever. But for me, my classes are about critically thinking. They're about learning to think. And again, like, I don't want to make any English teachers out there mad who are like, we're teaching, I know you're teaching critical thinking as well, but what I'm saying is, and you're teaching journalism, so you're not going to allow people to just turn in something that has no structure to it, or no, that's the purpose of your class. One of the purposes of what you're teaching is how to write something. Well, what I'm teaching is how to think about something. And so the writing part of it and the way that you deliver it isn't what you want to work on first. The first thing you want to work on is playing around with the idea. And if you think about any academic, I mean, any one of us got to the position we're in now because we did that to some degree. Like, we weren't born understanding institutionalized racism. We weren't born understanding a history of marginalizing people and hiding it in clever ways. We all had to, hopefully, are learning, continuing to learned those things. And we did, like, if I think about, you know, um, how I thought about things when I was 20 years old, 18 years old. I mean, I think that the core of me was still there, but I just didn't know enough to necessarily think about things in the same way. I didn't know enough about the world or about people. I mean, there were no trans people when I was growing up. I mean, obviously there were trans people when I was growing up, but people were deep underground. They were deep in the closet. So if you ask me about trans people when I'm 19, I probably wouldn't have the same things to say now, just because I really had no understanding of what it was to be trans. And
Mm.
uh, so, yeah, you have to learn about and go through an evolution to get to a point, and not that, and to continue, hopefully. But that requires a certain amount of trial and error, and putting things out there and thinking about them and thinking like, no, that's not right.
Mhm.
And if you're
So
not allowed to go through that, express that, at least to one other person, then how are you going to get to a point where you kind of understand the fallacy of what you had originally thought, or how you might have been clouded by internalized misogyny, internalized shame, internalized toxic masculinity, whatever.
mm, yeah, it's really good to hear you say that, because there's so many people who think they understand higher education, and they think like you walk into a classroom and dogma, and you're going to just like, sort of train these young students to think liberally, and or think like, liberal ideology. And it's really not like, obviously there's some teachers who might do that, but most are focused on the material, and it's a place of safe, in the sense of like, you can't learn when you're feeling judged.
Mm.
And so it's, I think it's good for people to hear that it doesn't matter who's in your classroom. It's a safe place for them to talk and get through these issues. Um, I wanted to sort of ask you a little bit about what I get sometimes, which is sort of this like mansplaining term. We're talking about language. Is
People tell you mansplain?
no, students have never told me of mansplain. It doesn't come up much other than like a joke, and a couple of my journalistic peers. There's another show, that I'm on sometimes, and it'll come up when I start talking about an issue I'm knowledgeable about. And I'm wondering like what you think of that term, and if it's a real term to you, and what does that mean? And how do men articulate knowledge of things without coming across as speaking for women?
Well, I love that term. I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, finally, there's a word for that.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but just like any term, it can be overused or used in the wrong context. But, mansplaining, for example, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I'm standing in line at a coffee shop or something, and this man starts telling me about pregnancy. Like he's in line with me, and I didn't know him at all. And he just starts telling me about what I was going to feel as a pregnant woman, the things that were going to happen to my body. And I was like 6 months pregnant, I'm like, I think I know. And he continued to explain, like, I mean, and somebody might be hearing this and thinking, oh, well, maybe he was telling you something that, you didn't know, or that he thought wasn't, no, he was telling me very basic things about what happens to the body, how you get cravings, how you get sick, and like, and not trying to empathize, not trying to say like, oh, has this happened? It was, well, and then this is going to happen. I'm like, yeah, I get it. And then he went on to then he asked, do you know what you're having? And I knew I was having a girl by then. Um, and he started to tell me what it was like to be a girl when you're, and like how difficult it could be to be a girl growing up, and especially in junior high, and the ways that girls can treat other girls in junior high. I mean, just it was amazing. And I said at one point, like, I know, I was a girl in junior high at one point. And he's like, well, being a girl in junior high in Southern California, I was like, I went to Santa Barbara Junior High. I'm very aware of what it's like. I mean, even after me telling this person, I have lived this experience. Why are you telling me what it's like to be a girl in junior high? He kept explaining it to me. That is mansplaining. Telling somebody something that they would have lived through, that they clearly would have experienced, and telling them, warning them that experience as though they had no understanding of it. And
Mhm.
so that term mansplaining comes from a good place, which is any person who, so if you have any marginalized group who there's a sort of cultural, whether it's internalized or overt, this understanding that like, oh, this group needs help, whether it's this group needs help because they're just not a smart group of people, or those, like getting back into social, classist, racist, whatever ways of dividing people. There's ideas that certain people just aren't that smart, or certain people just aren't that cultured, or certain people, and one of those is women are just caught in the headlights and need help navigating their life. And so when you have that as part of a culture or a society where you have sexism or racism and you internalize some of it, it's part of an institutional cultural structure around you. You come to believe and think like, oh, I need to help this person. I need to show this person the way because I know the way, because I'm one of the gifted, smart, incredible people in society. And this is one of the ignorant, sad, lost people in society. So any person in a position of privilege, and there's lots of different positions of privilege you can be in, needs to question, okay, I'm talking to somebody, I'm talking to them in a way where maybe I think I'm doing the right thing, but how is my privilege blinding me right now so that I'm actually patronizing and condescending to them instead of being an ally or being helpful right now. I think any person with any type of privilege, whether it's white privilege, it's male privilege, it's heterosexual privilege, whatever type of privilege you're working with, are you acting as an ally or are you condescending and patronizing this person and you can't see it because you're so overwhelmed by your privilege? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's really well said. And I think that people use the term broadly anytime a man starts to like explain things. And clearly there's different like levels of that. And when men try to tell you what it's like to be pregnant or to be a girl in junior high, that's like the textbook definition of
Right.
mansplaining for
Right.
sure. And I see it a lot too, even as me, and I see it generationally. I'm not young, I'm not right in the middle, the age thing, but um, old white men interrupt me all the time. They always have. Um, we're getting back to language. So maybe a sentence comes out and it's not phrased in a way they would say it. They're going to take over because they're either impatient or they think they're helping me or they want to show me how smart they are. So there's a generational thing. And I will literally stop communication with anyone who's like interrupting me. Like if I can't feel safe to like talk, then I'm not going to talk to you. It's not worth my time. It happens in the workplace, right? It just happens all the time. And then I think that I've seen it with women too. So whatever I experience, double it with women or whatever exponent you want to put on it, it's worse. Because there's this thing that men are raised with in this Western culture of you need to be the one to take over when needed. Okay. And that means also in language, and one of the things we learn in journalism in teaching is, if you're interviewing somebody, you don't finish their questions. You don't finish their answers. You
Right.
don't try to put their words into your own words because you can't quote yourself. And so one of the most effective things you can do in journalism when interviewing somebody is to shut up and get comfortable with pauses and silence. And if something's silent for like 30 seconds, okay, rephrase your question. But some of the best stuff when you're interviewing somebody comes after their silence because they're thinking.
Right.
And we want them to think before they speak. And so I think that's a trait, a sort of a good thing to learn. Anyone who's watching is that women do not need to have their words repackaged and put in a nice little bundle. And now you've endorsed it, old man, and now it's good and normal. And we just see that in group communication too. I think you and I maybe have talked about that. I know this happens to me all the time. I will say something in a group, not much reaction. The same older dude in power will say it, and everyone's like, whoa. And I'm like, that is so weird. Is it? I don't know why. It's just because I know why. Is that even though I tend to ramble, just as Josh, I can talk a lot. I don't talk, my cadence. I don't talk in a way of like, I just don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is how it is. And a lot of men, that's just the only way they talk is like, step one is this, step two is this, step three is this, and then the outcome is here. And I don't
Yeah.
do that. I do like step 12, 9, 6, 3, 1. I'm just but it is so true. You know?
Yeah. Well, and I think Bobby Darin said people hear what they see. So again, if we live in a society that turns certain people, whether it's because of skin color, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, whatever, into the ones who are supposed to know, and whether we admit it to ourselves or not, we've come to accept that yeah, we have that bias, that when you see a white cis man talking, you think he knows what he's talking about, I better listen, as opposed to you see somebody who doesn't fit that description, you're like, man, just rambling. Get to your point already.
Actually,
And
I've never been told that ever.
well, and I think, you said it's worse. You were describing kind of what happens to you, and you said it's worse for women, but I think it's all bad. It's all bad. Like it's all bad to either mansplain or to white splain or to, whatever, however old splain, like however you want to put it, whatever offensive term you want to put it in. It's all sort of the same thing where you're assuming that you know more because of your position in society, because you're whatever, versus this person, which clearly doesn't know as much as you do, or doesn't understand the world in the same way that you do. And it's interesting. I mean, I, I'm I'm always interested in like the ways in my life that people have told me like what I should say or what I shouldn't say. Like I said somebody was dead once to somebody, and they said, you need to say past. They passed. And I was like, oh, sorry, but they are dead. Or I this probably happens to you too, because people don't always understand what is bigoted or not bigoted, and they tend to sort of, anything that sounds like it might be bigoted, they like back away from without really thinking like, wait a minute, what am I actually saying? By telling someone they shouldn't call themselves this or they shouldn't say this. Because I can't imagine how many women might tell me, when I just said that I embrace the word bitch or the C word, how many women and men who would tell me, oh, you shouldn't call yourself that, or you shouldn't embrace that word, and telling me that like my experience and my thought process with this isn't correct, and I've clearly been jaded. I've had people tell me not to call myself a Jew before. Like I refer to myself as a Jew, and I've had non-Jewish people say, I had this one colleague of ours tell me once, you shouldn't call yourself that, and she was not Jewish. And I said, but that's what I am. That's a descriptive word. I understand that people have used it in a derogatory way in the past, but it is a descriptive word. It's not a derogatory word that was made up for a group of people. And so if you are uncomfortable with that term, you might have some, I don't know, anti-Semitism buried somewhere in there. And okay, I didn't say all of that, but she said, my husband's Jewish and he doesn't like that term. It's a bigoted term. It's an anti-Semitic term. And I wanted to say to her, I think that your husband has some internalized anti-Semitism, but we weren't going to go there. I just basically said like, well, it's a descriptive term. It's what I am. And if somebody sees that as derogatory, then maybe they should question why they see what I am as something negative. And it's probably similar for you. I mean, have you had a similar experience because you're Mexican, right? So like I think a lot of people, I've heard people whisper that term before where they're like, well, they're Mexican. It's like, that's a nationality. You can say it. There's nothing wrong with being Mexican. If you think that you can't say the word Mexican without it being insulting, then maybe you should explore why you think it's an insulting term when it's a descriptive term. And it doesn't even mean any, like we tend to attach color to culture. And we think like, oh, Mexican means brown. No, it doesn't. Any Mexican person has a redheaded cousin or some
Green-eyed.
yeah. Has
Yeah,
that
no,
happened to you? Have you had to have the discussion where people are like, is it okay if I call you Mexican? Or are you
well, it's with me, it's like some people, all they see is Mexican person. That's all Josh is, right?
right?
And then there's other people who are like, oh, he's just like kind of like a white dude. and so that I think that's a problem that people of mixed race experience, and that they're judged by that in terms of like, you're too Mexican, you're too white, you're not enough Mexican, you're not enough white. I cannot hang out with surfer bro dudes to save my life. I just don't know what to talk about. I'm too serious. I'm too intense. I don't want to talk about the wave. I just don't care, and I don't understand it. Right. I want to talk about what we talk about. Right. But if I'm hanging around with family and stuff, it's like I'm not Mexican enough. I'm a sellout too. And it's like very, like, you just don't feel connected and involved. And then there's the whole language thing too, that we're judged by, is like, oh, you don't speak Spanish, then you're not a real one. It's like, well, what is that? What does that mean? That Why are we judging people on that? I don't know. Has anyone ever judged you, Geordie, on like, you don't speak Spanish, Geordie?
Well,
How?
people have judged me on that because
Well,
I've
because
been,
academia.
well, and because I live in Southern California, and
Yeah.
I've been married to like multiple people of like I was married to a Mexican man and a man from Spain. It's like, why aren't you speaking Spanish? I speak some Spanish. I mean,
Yeah.
un poquito,
Yeah.
but I didn't
Yes.
take it to school.
Yeah, but it's just a weird thing, and then the more comfortable people get with you, like, if you become friends and close, then you start to hear them make the, like, Mexican jokes, like, in front of you, and you're just like, "Wow, I didn't know, like, being this close meant that you could make jokes about how hard I work and how I'm always late. I didn't realize that that meant I gave you that privilege to do that?" And it's sort of, I'm actually not always late. I make a point to always be early, so no one will say that to me. And when they do say it, it really pisses me off. But we're not
Have
going
you made that point when we meet?
What's
Because
that? Oh yeah.
have you made that point when you and I meet? Because I'm not sure.
No, I don't really care what other people do. I mean, I just like, if I try to be early for me, and if somebody's early or late, whatever, I don't judge on that, but I don't want to be judged. So I
Right.
purposely don't do that. Or yeah, if I'm constantly late and canceling plans or something, yeah, judge me for it, because that's irresponsible. That's actually behavior. That's not stereotype and expectation. Before we go, I wanted to make one thing is, it's died. It's dead. And in journalism, because students will do this, students will write, because one of the assignments is obituaries. They learn how to write news obituaries, and they'll always write passed away or passed on. And I'm always telling them no, because that's a euphemism. We don't know. We don't, you can believe what you want, but
Right.
here's what we do know. We do know they're dead, like, in
Right.
this world. Okay. Whether they went somewhere else, maybe we'll find out someday. Hopefully we will. But this is a story that needs to appeal to everyone of all religion. I mean, just as many
Right.
people as we can without offending them. And so, yeah, I agree. And that's the thing with journalism, is all about language and accuracy and precision and trying not to offend. And there's plenty of terms, and we're constantly changing. The Associated Press style book every year gets updated. They add new terms, they take away terms, they say these things are correct. Latin X is, we didn't talk about that too much, but like, that's a term that is found its way into the style book. But it's super controversial because not all Latinos want that term. Some people actually think it's offensive, while others think it's offensive to say Latino. And it's like, so hard to figure out. And then journalists would get accused of being, you know, something ist. It's like, no, it's just that the conversation's constantly changing all the time with everyone on this issue, and it's can't please everybody. So what do you expect us to do? You know,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that is something to keep in mind with language in general, is you're not going to please everyone. I mean, if I say past now because that person reprimanded me for saying dead, well, then I am conjuring up a specific idea of what happens when you die, which is a religious idea that you pass on to another place, another life, whatever. So what happens when I say that to somebody who's like, no, you're dead, you're in the ground, it's it, you're done,
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the thing. I mean, and talking about yeah, language in general, it is a work in progress. It's like culture. It's constantly evolving with culture. So giving people leeway, allowing people to make their mistakes and come back from it and try to learn from it. I think that's the best way to go forward with language in general, is allowing people their mistakes and to learn from their mistakes, right? That
Mhm.
we can learn from, and to understand that things are constantly changing, and that certain things are going to trigger certain people. And you're not always going to know what that is. Like, I hate the word gooey. I'm not going to tell you why,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
but how would anybody know that word to me is this gigantic trigger, right?
Mhm. I don't like that word either. I like the word squabble. I try to put that in my stories as often as I can. It's just a funny word.
Yeah, yeah. My mother used to say that word all the time in reference to me and my sister.
Stop squabbling.
Bubbling.
All right. Well, I think this is another good conversation, and I appreciate you taking time to fit it in. So thank you.
Well, and next time you want to talk about television?
Yeah,
Yeah.
our favorite TV shows growing up and what they mean to us. I will admit right now, as a preview to the next one, that anytime throughout the day that I can put a Seinfeld reference in the conversation, I do it because this show's funny. But there's plenty of other shows I grew up on, like the 70s and 80s, and this, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I so much of what I've learned. I mean, this when we're gonna start talking, where we gotta go, but like people think that you go to school, you go to college, and just like your parents and your grandparents and books and blah blah blah. Like people grow up in different ways, and for some people, television is was their teacher for
Yeah.
many years, and so
Transformative was a view to cultures and ideas outside of the very narrow culture and idea of my family.
exactly.
Yeah. 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 So that can be our next topic. And we can talk about this guy on my shirt. That is
Oh
LeVar
yeah,
Burton, the great LeVar Burton, who was transformative to me in reading Rainbow and Star Trek. So yeah. And
yeah.
of course,
Roots.
and of course, yeah, as Kunta Kinte, of course.
Yeah, no, that yeah, he's definitely a great actor and warm person, and from what I've seen of him. Okay, thanks, Shorty. Have a great day.
All right. Bye.